And you see, they're the ones that spoke out about the injustice that was being done to the colonists. And you know, back then when they were speaking out against the colonists, after the war, they asked the British, who made the biggest difference and why the British lost the Revolutionary War? You would have think surely they would have said George Washington, the commander of the revolution, right? No, they didn't pick George Washington. How about Thomas Jefferson, who framed the incredible words of the Declaration of Independence? No, they didn't say Thomas Jefferson. Oh, maybe it was the great orator, Patrick Henry, who said, give me liberty or give me death. No, they didn't choose him either. Well, maybe Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Dr. Benjamin Rush. Surely they would have chose some of these great men. No, they chose none of them. They said it was the Black Robe Regiment. The Black Robe Regiment was pastors, priests, rabbis who spoke from the pulpit about the injustice that was being done to the colonists. And we know this, by the way, is because we have a lot of their sermons in history, so we know. So when they spoke about the Declaration of Independence, a lot of the grievances you find in the Declaration of Independence, guess what? They were preached from the pulpit so that the people knew what was going on. So, again, when those incredible words you hear, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That was like a flame that was lit in the middle of a dark world. And you say, where did the founders get these revolutionary ideas? Well, if you go to college or look online, it'll usually give you three main sources. It'll mention John Locke, who was a theologian. It'll mention Montesquieu, who was a philosopher. Or it probably does mention William Blackstone, who was a judge. Those were the three that they give that most of the ideas for our founders got for the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. But when they did a major study, they found something a lot different. They found that the founders quoted one source more than all those combined. Anybody know what it might be? The Bible. Good, an informed audience. Jefferson would be proud. So the Bible, yes, the Bible was the main source. So, for example, I always use one example. Most of the ideas that came from the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence actually came most from the Old Testament and most from the Torah. But I'll use Isaiah 33:22 to give an example. Okay, in Isaiah 33:22, Jehovah is our judge. That's judicial branch. Okay? Jehovah is our lawgiver, the legislative branch. And Jehovah is our king, the executive branch. These were the things that they taught from the pulpit. So, you know, I think a lot of the times you hear about preaching, you know, from the pulpit, and everybody kind of bristles up sometimes, as you know what I mean. But that's not what happened back then. That's how the patriots were informed. That's how the colonists knew what were going on through these men preaching. So, again, the founders thought so much of the Bible, and I love John Adams, I love a lot of the founders, but John Adams said, suppose a distant nation would take the Bible as its only law book, and each citizen would conduct their lives based on the principles found in that book. What a utopia. What a paradise that place would be. Wow. And that's just one of the founders. Most of them love the Bible very dearly, no matter what you may hear. So, again, a lot of times people get mad and say we shouldn't talk about politics in church. But you know what? When we're talking about that in the beginning, God created male and female, we're not talking about politics. When we talk about against abortion, we're not talking about politics. When we talk about a government that wants to remove God and the Bible from every foundation, every part of society that we know, we are not talking politics. When they want to talk about, during COVID, removing our rights to go to church, which in many states they did, or to assemble, Thankfully, we were in the free state of Florida. Amen. And we had a great governor, Ron DeSantis, who kept us free. So guess what? We're not talking politics. So, again, people really get upset sometimes when you say you're talking about politics from church. But it goes back to the Founders' Days. There was two, and I heard our pastor mention one of them, so we didn't plan that, did we? No, Peter Muhlenberg. John Peter Muhlenberg. We had two pastors. Many of you know this story, but there's two pastors. One was Peter Muhlenberg, and another was his brother, Frederick Muhlenberg. They both pastored a church during the time of the Revolution. Peter Muhlenberg was a patriot. He loved what was going on in the cause. Frederick, his brother, who was in New York, thought that, pastors shouldn't get involved in all that political stuff. Matter of fact, he even questioned whether Christians should be so involved in that. But guess what? They went back and forth with letters back then. They didn't call them phones and phones back then, but they went back and forth with letters. Again, we have these letters. So they went back and forth. Matter of fact, it got so heated that Peter called his brother Frederick a Tory. It's kind of a curse word, isn't it? Yeah. Some people know what a Tory was. That was a British sympathizer. So again, they fought back and forth in battle. But guess what happened? Something happened that changed Frederick's mind. When the British came in, began to bombard New York, and then took it over, they went into his church and ransacked it, and put up British soldiers in it who mocked it and drank and partied in it. Many other churches throughout the colonies were burnt to the ground. Boy, let me tell you, Frederick changed his mind quickly. And if you know what? Peter and Frederick, thankfully, are still, you know how they want to tear statues down? Well, if you go to, which I've been in Washington, D.C., the Capitol building, there's a statuary hall. You will see John Peter Muhlenberg, a statue of him there. And also, they both got involved in politics. They both fought in the war. And matter of fact, his brother Frederick went on, became the first Speaker of the House. So these were pastors. So a big difference. But you know what? Let's talk about Peter a little bit. When he went back to his church, he had one last sermon. And boy, was it a doozy. He turned from the book of Ecclesiastes 3. And he said, many of you probably know this pretty well. There is appointed a time for everything. There is a time for everything under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what's been planted. A time to cry and a time to laugh. And he went on reading this and he said, there's a time for peace. And there's a time for war. And there's a time to be silent. And there's a time to speak out. And then he did something to his congregation that they never knew was going to happen. Underneath his black robe was, guess what? His continental. Guess what? He had a continental uniform under his robe. But he did more than that. At that same time, he gathered together 200 to 300 of his congregation, the men, and gathered them together, and they signed on to the revolution. They were known as the 8th Regiment, and they fought under General Washington as a cavalry. They did incredible throughout the war. And if you go to Washington, to the Capitol building, you also will go and see, many of you see the massive pictures, you're familiar with the artist John Turnbull, I believe is his name. Well, John Turnbull had these beautiful pictures, and you'll see one is a picture of the surrender of Yorktown by General Cornwallis from the British. If you look in the picture, there's actually a picture, you'll see John Peter Muhlenberg in the picture. So he went on just being an incredible patriot. So again, you can see what a difference these pastors made. Still, we hear today, okay, how many people tell us, I just don't want to talk about politics. I don't want to talk about religion. A lot of people say that, and that's all right. That's your opinion. Nothing wrong with that. That's the way you feel, then that's fine. But there comes a time, what would the founders say? And remember, when I say the founders, many people in the past held the founders in great awe. They believed the founders, and this is not just Republicans, by the way. It's Democrats. You can go through and read all the history of the presidents, and you will see that all the presidents, all the way through John Kennedy, believed and loved the founders. President John Kennedy, a great, great man, he spoke out a lot about the founders, by the way. Matter of fact, when he had all the Nobel Peace Prize winners at the White House, he said, you know what? This is the greatest gathering of human knowledge, I think, almost ever, except for the exception when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. That's the kind of reverence that all Republicans and Democrats in America had for the founders. Were they perfect men? By no part. They weren't perfect, but they pushed perfect ideas because the ideas were from the Bible. We were founded on that book. So again, what would the founders say to a person? And again, you can have your opinion, but what would the founders say to you? Thomas Jefferson. If you told him, you know, I don't want to talk about religion or politics, I don't want to even follow it, he would say, fine, that's your choice. But if you expect to be ignorant and free, you expect what never has been or never will be. That's not my words. That's Thomas Jefferson's words. Again, what other founders? George Washington. What would he have said to us? He said there was two indispensable supports that led to political, yes, I used the word political prosperity, religion and morality. And he said if you went after those in government, he would question your patriotism. Again, not my words, George Washington's words. And how about, I could go on and on with what they believed, that we had to be informed. We had to know what was going on. Benjamin Franklin. Interesting, because I know a lot of you may not like debating and arguing and talking, but you know what? None of our founding documents would have happened. They debated fiercely and argued, but they did it again. They were all Americans. They did it somewhat in love, maybe, not all of them. But guess what? You know, when they were trying to bring the Constitution, to work out the Constitution, they didn't think they were going to be able to bring it. They didn't think it was going to happen. And guess what? Benjamin Franklin, the oldest delegate at the time, he didn't speak out a lot at that point, but he spoke out. And he said, the older I get, the more I'm convinced of one thing. God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow does not fall to the ground without his notice, it is doubtful that a nation can rise without his help. It is told that they came back together and there was a new spirit. And guess what? Still debated, still argued, still disagreed, but they found that incredible document, the Constitution. So again, and then I will draw on a founder who many of you may have heard of. I had the great honor to meet this founder, and you said, what the heck? You're not even, how could you meet a founder? It was about as close to a modern founder as you could find. It was President Ronald Reagan. And you know what? He personified Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. And guess what he said on his farewell address? He had a warning to the nation. He said that he said the patriotism has returned, but guess what? It hasn't returned to our institution. It hasn't returned to our schools. Boy, did he know something? He said, we need to bring it back into the schools and say what it is to be an American. And then he had a message for us. He said, you know where all things happen? You know where all the beginning of things happen? Local. At the dinner table, he said. And he said, you know what? That's where you teach your children. He says, guess what? He said, if you're if your parents aren't teaching you what it is to be an American, you say something to them and you nail them on it. Because that would be a very American thing to do, right? And again, not my words, President Reagan's words. So, again, we can see these incredible founders, what they believed in and what they stood for. And I guess the best to kind of sum it up is John Adams. John Adams said he would tell us prosperity, us, future generations, that there would come a time, what would we do with the freedom that we've been given? And when we think about how many men and women have died in the wars so that me and you could be free, maybe he summed it up. He said, none of us will ever know what that generation gave for our freedom. And if we didn't do wise with it, if we didn't do well with it, he would look down from heaven and repent that he even gave half a measure to save it. We don't want John Adams or any of the other ones looking down from heaven repenting because of our generation. So it's up to us. It's up to us to vote. It's up to us to be involved, however we feel like we need to be involved. That is up to us. Because if we are not involved, the sacred fire of liberty that has burned so brightly in this country for so long will be extinguished. So it's up to us. Let's make sure that we pass on to the next generation the sacred fire of liberty that's burning bright. God bless everyone. God bless America. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.